You ever see a scene so ridiculous, so perfectly petty that you actually stop and wonder if you're still dreaming? That was me right there on the edge of Willowbrook Lake, the morning sun catching on the glassy water while the whole neighborhood just stood there in total shock, mouths hanging open. Picture this. A 6-foot-tall wooden fence, brand new and perfectly straight, slicing right through what used to be our beautiful shared lakefront, dividing lawns, blocking access and splitting the community dock right down the middle like some kind of Cold War border. And on one side of that fence, there's Margaret Karen's cousin, clutching her fancy coffee mug with a look on her face like someone just shot her dog, all her expensive lounge chairs, her little jet ski ramp, everything trapped behind solid wood panels. On the other side, that was me, sweat dripping down my face, setting the final bolt and giving everybody a nice friendly wave, just soaking it all in. Let me back up a second so you get the full picture, because I swear you can't make this stuff up. About 5 years back, I bought what I thought was my forever home. Willowbrook Estates, nice and quiet, a dream for anyone who ever wanted a slice of lake life. The main reason I paid a premium. The property came with deeded access to the lake, real lakefront rights, not just use the beach if no one's looking. My kids grew up with sand between their toes, fishing off the dock, making s'mores around the fire pit on summer nights. I thought we'd landed in paradise. Then 6 months ago, everything changed like the weather, but worse, when Karen Fitzgerald took over as our HOA president. You ever met someone who gets a little power and suddenly thinks they're Napoleon? That's Karen. Within weeks, she was fining people for grass that was half an inch too tall, banning wind chimes for noise pollution, making us fill out paperwork just to plant flowers if they weren't on her magic list. The kicker, she put her brother-in-law on the payroll as the official landscape inspector. Her best friend landed the pool maintenance gig, and when her cousin Margaret came to town, it's like the rules didn't apply to them at all. The first sign something was off showed up on a Tuesday morning. I walk out to the lake and see Margaret not just sitting with a chair and a book, but setting up a full-blown outdoor living room. I'm talking pro-grade lounge chairs, a sound system fit for Coachella tiki torches, even workers building a jet ski ramp. This wasn't a relaxing afternoon. She was basically building her own lakeside resort, blocking our access and wrecking our view in the process. So I did what any good neighbor would do. I walked over, introduced myself, and tried to be civil. Margaret looked at me like I was gum on her shoe. She flat out said Karen had reassigned this whole section of the lakefront for her private use while she was in town. Apparently my family was just wasting the space by not using it every single day, and Margaret needed it to entertain her book club. When I pointed out that the waterfront was shared property legally deeded to several houses, she actually waved a document in my face and told me to take it up with the HOA. Some easement reassignment she claimed the board had unanimously approved, never mind that 2 board members were on a cruise that week. You ever get that feeling you're being hustled? Yeah, that happened. So I got on the phone, city planning, county records, anybody with access to the paperwork. Turns out the HOA didn't have a leg to stand on. The lake access was written into the property deeds not managed by the HOA, and any change would require actual legal work signed by every affected homeowner. Karen's little reassignment was about as legit as a $3 bill. I brought all this up at the next HOA meeting thinking maybe we could talk it out. Instead, Karen doubled down, clutching the podium and practically hissing that they'd changed the bylaws to give the board full control of waterfront management. Anyone who interfered would be fined $500 a day. She even had paperwork that proved this had been voted in during a secret meeting no one else remembered. Meanwhile, Margaret was partying, nonstop blasting music at all hours, leaving trash everywhere, and that jet ski ramp was now sticking out into the lake like a middle finger to the rest of us. It got real personal when my 8-year-old daughter tried to go for her morning swim, and Margaret physically blocked her, telling her the beach was now private. Seeing my little girl come home in tears, that was it. Now, I'm a contracts lawyer by trade, so you better believe I know how to find a loophole. I spent the next week digging through everything: my original purchase agreement, the HOA charter, 2 decades of meeting minutes. What I found was better than gold. Not only was the lake access irrevocably deeded, but the HOA's own charter spelled out in plain English that the board had zero authority to change property rights any attempt, and they were personally liable for damages. So I drafted a formal notice to the HOA, and Margaret, they had 72 hours to clear out, or I'd take legal action. Sent it certified mail, too. That's when Karen, Margaret, and this guy who claimed to be their lawyer, He looked like he learned law from old reruns, showed up at my door. They tried the whole routine: threats, bribes, Karen promising to waive my HOA fees, Margaret offering to let my kids use the lake on alternating Wednesdays, and their lawyer rambling about adverse possession like it was some magic spell. I didn't bite, just showed them my credentials and watched them storm off in a cloud of threats. Of course, the 72 hours passed, and Margaret only doubled down: more chairs, more construction, now trying to put up a permanent shade structure. That's when I moved to phase 2. I hired a surveyor, got the property lines mapped out to the inch, and headed to the hardware store to pick up enough fencing to make the point crystal clear. Word travels fast in small towns. By the time I got home, half the neighborhood was already gossiping about my crazy fence plan. I told anyone who asked I was just marking my property, nothing more. The next morning at the crack of dawn, I was down at the water with a full crew. Permits in hand, survey flag set, we started building the fence right down the line from the edge of my property across the beach, splitting the dock and onto the water. It was honestly a thing of beauty if you appreciate poetic justice. Margaret came out in her robe, coffee splashing everywhere, just in time to see her entire setup get boxed in. She screamed. Karen showed up in curlers. Half the neighborhood followed, some with folding chairs like it was free theater. Karen had a meltdown for the ages, screaming about vandalism, trespassing, even intentional infliction of emotional distress, and for some reason, identity theft. She called the police. They looked at my paperwork, shrugged, and left. She called the city. Same result. She called the mayor, her congressman, and for all I know, the president. Each call ended with her voice getting higher and higher like a kettle left on the stove. Meanwhile, Margaret's elaborate beach setup was ruined. Half her jet ski ramp was blocked. Her fancy sound system now had one speaker on each side of the fence, and the shade structure she tried to build straddled the line, useless on both sides. She just stood there, opening and closing her mouth while her workers packed up and drove off. That night, the emergency HOA meeting was a full house. Karen passed out flyers calling me a neighborhood terrorist, saying I was destroying property values and community spirit. I didn't have to say a word. Turns out I wasn't the only one who'd been pushed too far. Tom Harrison, retired judge, stood up and calmly explained that the board was personally liable for every bit of this. Sarah Chen, whose roses got bulldozed by Karen's beautification project, had her own legal printouts. Homeowners started lining up one after another, all with stories, all with evidence. By the time they were done, it wasn't a meeting, it was a revolution. The calls for Karen to resign started as a whisper but turned into a roar. Then, just when you thought the circus couldn't get any weirder, Margaret's husband showed up from out of state. He took one look at the fence, the mess, and Margaret's ugly crying, and just shook his head. I overheard him say, "We're leaving. I'm done with this whole fiasco." And just like that, Margaret and her stuff disappeared. Karen tried one last Hail Mary, announcing an executive order as HOA president to remove the fence. But the board's own attorney, who had spent the meeting scribbling furiously, finally cut her off. He explained in front of everyone that not only did she have zero authority, but her actions put the HOA at massive risk of lawsuits. The board wasted no time, voted her out on the spot. But it wasn't over. They voted to go after her for misuse of HOA funds. Seems she'd used the association's money to pay for Margaret's easement documents and lined her brother-in-law's pockets with fake landscaping bills. Forensic accountants got involved. 3 months later, Karen was in court, mascara running, as the judge read out the verdict: guilty of embezzlement, fraud, and breaching her duty to the community. 2 years probation, $47,000 in restitution, and 300 hours of picking up trash by the side of the highway. And you know what? I was there watching, and the gavel sounded just about right. Now the fence is still standing straight as ever. The dock's split. The neighborhood feels lighter, and there's this quiet satisfaction every time I walk past and see folks using their rightful slice of the lake. But not everyone agrees. Some say I went too far, that the fence was overkill. Others call it justice. Me, I think sometimes you have to draw a line, literally, so folks remember what's fair. So what would you have done? Drop a comment. Where do you draw the line between standing up for your rights and just letting things go? I'd love to hear your take on it, because in a place like Willowbrook, you never know what tomorrow's drama will be.